On the morning of March 12, 1932, a single gunshot echoed through a luxurious Paris apartment, instantly erasing the architect of the world's most sprawling financial empire. Inside the opulent, blood-stained bedroom lay Ivar Kreuger. He was a man who at that exact moment was expected at a critical meeting with the most powerful central bankers on Earth. The French police found him fully dressed, a heavy pistol resting near his right hand. Down the street, international financiers waited anxiously in a grand boardroom. They were completely unaware that the supposed savior of the global economy was already dead. The sudden silence in that apartment marked the detonation of a devastating financial time bomb. The sudden death of Ivar Kreuger sent an immediate, terrifying shockwave through every major capital in the Western world. He was not merely a wealthy industrialist, but the undisputed match king. He was the solitary mastermind behind the colossal Swedish match company. Millions of ordinary investors across the globe had trusted him with their entire life savings. His violent demise instantly threatened the fiscal stability of entire nations. These desperate countries had foolishly tied their sovereign survival to his complex, hidden ledger. Panic gripped the international markets as rumors spread that his vast enterprise was actually a fragile illusion. The impending collapse would soon rival the devastating fallout of the 1929 Great Depression. To understand how one man acquired such dangerous, unchecked leverage, we must look back to the shattered landscape of the early 1920s. European governments, utterly devastated by the First World War, were effectively locked out of traditional credit markets. These fractured nations were starving for the hard cash required to rebuild their ruined cities and infrastructure. Rampant post-war inflation and highly volatile currencies made borrowing nearly impossible for these newly formed republics. The established banking institutions of London and New York viewed sovereign lending to these unstable states as a catastrophic risk. A profound vacuum of capital emerged across the continent. It was waiting for a financier bold enough to exploit the panic. Into this desperate void stepped Kreuger, offering an unprecedented and highly unorthodox pitch to these struggling nations. He provided massive multi-million-dollar loans directly to state treasuries. He was essentially acting as a private, one-man international monetary fund. He bypassed traditional commercial banks entirely to deliver immediate, liquid capital to countries on the brink of total default. Operating through his central financial vehicle, Kreuger and Toll, he transferred vast sums of gold and foreign currency across borders. Governments eagerly accepted these lifeline loans to balance their bleeding budgets and stabilize their sinking economies. In return, the Match King required a very specific, highly lucrative form of collateral to secure the massive debt. The catch was a brilliant masterpiece of corporate extraction. Kreuger demanded exclusive monopoly concession contracts from every single borrowing nation. This meant the Swedish match company gained the sole legal right to manufacture, import, and sell matches within those sovereign borders. Entire populations were suddenly forced by law to buy their daily fire from a single foreign entity. By securing these aggressive, ironclad contracts, Kreuger transformed a simple household necessity into an inescapable daily tax. This invisible tax was collected directly by his private corporation. State sovereignty was quietly traded away in exchange for short-term liquidity. This aggressive strategy built an industrial behemoth, but it also laid the foundation for a spectacular, system-breaking disaster. To manage this unprecedented geopolitical maneuver, Ivar Kreuger engineered a labyrinthine corporate structure that deliberately defied conventional accounting. At its absolute center sat Kreuger and Toll, an incredibly complex holding company designed to act as the central financial nervous system for his entire global operation. This entity dictated every movement of capital across his vast, interconnected domain. Kreuger and Toll functioned as an impenetrable firewall between the physical match factories and his aggressive sovereign lending practices. By burying the actual industrial production beneath dozens of layers of subsidiary corporations, the holding company completely obscured the true flow of wealth. It was a masterpiece of financial obfuscation that kept international regulators entirely in the dark. Beneath that opaque financial canopy lay a staggering physical footprint that rapidly spanned the globe. At its absolute peak, the Swedish match company controlled over 200 active factories across more than 40 sovereign nations. It was an industrial behemoth that physically dominated the manufacturing landscape, employing tens of thousands of workers in its sprawling, smoke-filled timber yards. Those massive facilities fed relentless, churning assembly lines that produced billions of matches every single day. Kreuger had successfully cornered the global market on a fundamental human necessity. Every time a family lit a kitchen stove or a street lamp flickered to life in a major capital, a fraction of a cent flowed directly back to the corporate vaults in Stockholm. Yet the steady profits from selling daily fire could not independently sustain the massive cash infusions he promised to desperate foreign governments. To fund these colossal sovereign loans, Kreuger turned his gaze across the Atlantic Ocean toward a new source of liquidity. He targeted the booming American middle class, seeking to extract the vast, unregulated wealth accumulating rapidly during the Roaring Twenties. He partnered with elite Wall Street syndicates to issue highly attractive, high-yield bonds directly to eager, everyday retail investors. By packaging the risky sovereign debt of fragile European nations into seemingly secure, dividend-paying securities, he tapped into an unprecedented reservoir of American capital. Millions of dollars poured into his holding company with alarming, unchecked speed. This aggressive transatlantic expansion harbored a fatal mechanical flaw hidden deep within the private ledgers of Kreuger and Toll. The actual revenue generated by the global match monopoly, while vast, was never mathematically sufficient to pay the exorbitant dividends he had promised to his American bondholders. The entire corporate structure was inherently insolvent from the very beginning. To maintain the flawless illusion of endless profitability, the holding company began engaging in a massive, systemic scheme of circular financing. Kreuger systematically diverted the fresh capital raised from new American investors to pay the lucrative returns owed to his earlier backers. The industrial empire was quietly transforming into a colossal, debt-fueled pyramid scheme operating on a global scale. The sheer audacity of this mechanical deception was perfectly masked by the profound psychological grip Kreuger held over the global financial elite. He was universally hailed in the international press as the savior of Europe. He was viewed as a solitary genius who was single-handedly stabilizing a broken continent when traditional central banks absolutely refused to intervene. This manufactured aura of absolute infallibility rendered the Match King completely untouchable in the eyes of the global market. Investors, politicians, and regulators trusted his brilliant reputation so implicitly that they willingly suspended all normal financial oversight. No one ever dared to demand a rigorous, independent audit of his shadowy, world-spanning corporate empire, leaving the monumental fraud entirely undetected. That illusion of endless prosperity shattered violently in October 1929. The American stock market collapsed with unprecedented speed, erasing vast corporate fortunes and private savings in a matter of hours. This catastrophic event triggered a relentless wave of global financial panic. The roaring optimism of the previous decade evaporated, immediately replaced by profound economic dread across the entire industrialized world. This sudden market crash officially ushered in the devastating era of the Great Depression. The global machinery of easy, unregulated credit abruptly ground to a complete halt. Major banks shuttered their doors, and terrified international lenders desperately hoarded whatever cash they had left. The speculative financial landscape that had incubated the rise of the Match King was irrevocably destroyed. For Ivar Kreuger, the sudden market collapse triggered an immediate and fatal liquidity crisis. His entire financial pyramid required a constant, massive influx of fresh capital from Wall Street to survive. But American middle-class investors, completely ruined by the crash, abruptly stopped buying Kreuger and Toll bonds. The vital transatlantic pipeline of new money was instantly and permanently severed. Without those continuous American investments, the central holding company could no longer pay the massive dividends it had promised to its earlier backers. The circular financing machine that powered the Swedish match company stalled overnight. Kreuger found himself trapped in a desperate scramble for hard currency to keep his sprawling global monopoly afloat. The magnificent house of cards was finally swaying. A secondary failure mechanism quickly compounded this severe capital drought. As the Great Depression deepened across the globe, international trade plummeted, and national economies severely contracted. The impoverished sovereign nations that had borrowed so heavily from Kreuger suddenly found their state treasuries completely empty. They simply could not generate the domestic tax revenue needed to service their massive foreign debts. One by one, these desperate countries began defaulting on the strict terms of their lucrative monopoly concession contracts. This created an inescapable, two-sided squeeze on the Swedish match company. Absolutely no new investment capital was flowing in from the West, and no loan repayments were arriving from the East. The core economic engine of the massive industrial empire had entirely seized up. To conceal this catastrophic insolvency, Kreuger retreated deep into the shadows of his own corporate labyrinth. He began frantically shuffling non-existent assets between hundreds of obscure, off-book shell companies. He instructed loyal accountants to invent phantom revenues and systematically erase mounting liabilities from the official ledgers. The sheer complexity of his global corporate structure became a weapon of deliberate obfuscation. He orchestrated these elaborate financial deceptions using incredibly crude but effective tools. Kreuger drafted forged telegrams from fake banking officials to verify imaginary deposits in distant accounts. He fabricated entire sets of corporate board minutes to authorize the urgent transfer of invisible funds. He was single-handedly writing a fictional narrative of financial health to pacify his increasingly nervous global creditors. When these intricate accounting tricks failed to generate actual cash, Kreuger took his most extreme and fatal step. Working entirely alone in his private office, he personally forged £25 million worth of Italian government bonds. He meticulously copied official signatures onto crude, unconvincing documents that claimed to represent massive sovereign debt. It was an act of absolute, unvarnished desperation. He locked these counterfeit Italian bonds in his personal safe, treating them as highly classified state secrets. He then used this forged collateral to secure emergency, short-term loans from unsuspecting European banks. These newly acquired fraudulent funds were immediately funneled out to pay imminent shareholder dividends, buying his rapidly collapsing empire just a few more months of borrowed time. By early 1932, the boardrooms of New York and Paris had grown thick with suspicion. The once reverent hushes that accompanied Ivar Kreuger's entrances were replaced by tense, hostile interrogations. Central bankers, battered by the ongoing Great Depression that began in 1929, were no longer blinded by the aura of the Match King. They scrutinized his opaque ledgers with newfound skepticism, searching for the cash his balance sheets promised, but his accounts lacked. The reckoning arrived when these financiers delivered an ultimatum. Before they would extend a single dollar of new credit to the struggling Swedish match company, they demanded a comprehensive, independent audit of the entire Kreuger and Toll empire. They insisted that outside accountants examine every subsidiary, every sovereign contract, and every physical asset. The invisible labyrinth of wealth was finally going to be dragged into the unforgiving light of day. For Kreuger, this demand for transparency was a death sentence. The emotional weight of his sprawling deception collapsed inward, crushing the man. He knew with absolute certainty that these independent auditors would inevitably demand to see the collateral held in his private safe. They would find the forged Italian bonds, exposing him not just as a failed industrialist, but as a desperate criminal. The impending exposure stripped away the illusion of the savior, leaving only the reality of ruin. There was no remaining financial maneuver, no new sovereign loan, and no forged telegram that could stop the approaching accountants. This agonizing certainty of public disgrace drove him back to his luxurious Paris apartment on that fateful March morning. The walls of his own creation had finally closed in, leaving him with only one grim exit. The gunshot that ended his life shattered the corporate facade, triggering a catastrophic financial reckoning. When the auditors finally accessed his vaults, they discovered that hundreds of millions of dollars had simply vanished into the ether. This spectacular collapse laid bare the systemic risks of unregulated international finance. It proved that a single, opaque monopoly could imperil the entire global banking system if left unchecked. In direct response to the devastation caused by the Swedish match company, governments worldwide began to rewrite the rules of corporate governance. The disaster served as a primary catalyst for sweeping legislative reform in the United States. Lawmakers realized that relying on the personal reputation of corporate titans was a recipe for economic suicide. They recognized the urgent need for a permanent, structural barrier against such elaborate accounting fraud. This realization birthed the modern era of financial regulation, fundamentally altering how corporations interact with the public. The United States Congress passed the Securities Act of 1933, a direct legislative reaction to the deceptive practices pioneered by Kreuger and Toll. This new legal framework mandated strict, standardized financial disclosures for any company offering shares to the public. It required that corporate financial statements be rigorously verified by independent third-party auditors. The Securities and Exchange Commission was subsequently established to enforce these transparency laws. The system was designed to eliminate the very shadows where the Match King had thrived. Companies could no longer legally shuffle liabilities between off-book shell entities without explicit public disclosure. The era of the unchecked, sovereign lending corporate monopoly was permanently dismantled by this new architecture of mandatory financial surveillance. These institutional safeguards arrived far too late for the people caught in the immediate blast radius. The liquidation of the Kreuger and Toll empire was a grueling international legal procedure that stretched on for years. Liquidators painstakingly seized whatever genuine assets remained, selling off match factories and concession contracts for fractions of their former value. The complex international bankruptcy proceedings left countless creditors fighting over a rapidly shrinking pool of capital. The human cost of this procedural unwinding was staggering. Ordinary investors across America and Europe, who had trusted their life savings to the seemingly invincible Swedish monopoly, were entirely wiped out. Families lost their homes, and municipal banks that had heavily invested in his bonds faced sudden insolvency. The meticulously crafted illusion of endless wealth dissolved into a harsh reality of ruined portfolios and shattered livelihoods. The collapse of the Swedish match company fundamentally altered how global markets assessed corporate trustworthiness and sovereign debt. Before the spring of 1932, international financiers assumed that a monopoly backed by government concession contracts was inherently immune to failure. That dangerous assumption died alongside Ivar Kreuger. The sudden realization that entire nations had been manipulated by a single, unregulated corporate entity forced a permanent reckoning in international finance. This skepticism reshaped the architecture of global lending for generations. Desperate governments could no longer casually trade their sovereign monopolies for quick cash injections without facing intense regulatory scrutiny. The Great Depression had already fractured the global economy, but this unprecedented deception proved that the very financial mechanisms designed to stabilize nations could instead accelerate their ruin. The world finally understood that unchecked corporate power, hidden behind complex international ledgers, posed a systemic threat to global stability. Today, the remnants of that once invincible operation are largely forgotten, but the warning remains. A simple wooden matchstick, once the currency of kings and the collateral of desperate nations, stands as a quiet testament to the ultimate fragility of an empire built entirely on shadows and debt.